Imagine Europe on the eve of war, the summer of 1914. The great capitals, London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, are alive with energy. Carriages still clatter on cobblestone streets, but automobiles are beginning to roar past them. Men in top hats hurry into banks and stock exchanges. Cafes buzz with debate about colonies, alliances, and the possibility of war. Yet beneath all the chatter, one thing holds the modern world together: gold. Gold was the bedrock of trust. If you held a pound note in Britain, a franc in France, or a mark in Germany, you knew it could be exchanged for real, glittering metal locked away in a vault. This was the gold standard, the invisible thread tying together the global economy. Bankers and politicians spoke of it with near religious reverence. It was stability, credibility, civilization itself. But here is the irony. That glittering stability was an illusion. The gold standard gave the impression of permanence, but it was fragile, a delicate house of cards, one that war would topple in a matter of days. Let me paint the picture for you. In 1914, the Bank of England's gold reserves amounted to about £38 million. Impressive, but nowhere near enough to cover the tidal wave of spending a modern war would demand. France, Germany, Russia all had their own piles of gold, but compared to the costs of mobilizing millions of men, of producing artillery, shells, uniforms, and feeding whole armies, the reserves were little more than a glittering decoration. Still, ordinary people believed in it. For the average worker or saver, a paper note backed by gold was as solid as the stone of Westminster or the Reichstag. It was real money. The idea that governments might break that promise was unthinkable. And yet, in the back rooms of ministries and smoke-filled offices of bankers, whispers had already begun. They knew that if war came, and it was looking more likely with each passing week, gold would not be enough. When the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand lit the fuse and the dominoes of alliances began to fall, the financial world held its breath. Investors panicked, stock markets convulsed, bank customers lined up, desperate to withdraw their savings in gold before it was too late. The illusion of infinite stability cracked almost immediately. In July 1914, the Vienna Stock Exchange collapsed, forcing Austria to shut down financial markets altogether. Berlin and Paris followed. London, the very heart of the global financial system, suspended trading for the first time in history. Newspapers didn't know what to say. One described the moment as the greatest financial crisis the world has ever seen. Governments faced a choice: keep their promises and let gold reserves vanish, or suspend the rules. Within weeks, the gold standard was abandoned. Banknotes could no longer be freely exchanged for gold. Money had become, in essence, a promise backed by nothing more than faith in the state. That moment, quiet, bureaucratic, hidden behind official announcements, was revolutionary. For centuries, gold had been wealth itself. Now, money was untethered. The world had stepped into an experiment. It was an experiment that would change everything. Because once leaders realized they could suspend gold, they discovered they could print, they could borrow, they could turn debt into a weapon. And from that moment on, the war was not just fought with rifles and cannons. It was fought with balance sheets, bond drives, and propaganda campaigns urging citizens to sacrifice their savings. The financial order of the 19th century had died in the first weeks of war. Something new, far more dangerous, had been born. And the ordinary saver, the shopkeeper, the factory worker, the clerk, would be the first casualty. The summer of 1914 should have been one of peace. Europe had not seen a great war in nearly half a century. Trains carried tourists to seaside resorts, families picnicked in city parks, and shop windows glittered with the new luxuries of the modern age. Phonographs, electric lamps, cameras. But beneath the surface, there was a strange tension in the air. Newspapers carried alarming headlines about Austria and Serbia. Rumors swirled in cafes about ultimatums and secret treaties. Yet most ordinary people shrugged it off. Surely, they thought, the diplomats would resolve it, as they always had before. Then came July 28th. Austria declared war on Serbia. Within hours, the calm cracked. Imagine standing outside a bank in Vienna that morning. The cobblestone streets are packed with men and women pressing against the doors. The mood is frantic, voices raised, children crying. Everyone wants the same thing: gold. They want their paper money turned into something solid, something safe, before it is too late. And this was not just Vienna. Similar scenes unfolded in Berlin, Paris, St. Petersburg. Crowds lined up outside banks, the word spreading like wildfire. Get your gold now while you still can. But there was a problem. The banks did not have enough. The very foundation of the financial system had always been confidence, the belief that paper notes could be redeemed at any time. But the truth, hidden until this moment, was that the reserves were a fraction of the promises printed on paper. If everyone asked for gold at once, the system collapsed, and that is exactly what was happening. The panic spread to the stock exchanges. On July 27th, the Vienna Stock Exchange collapsed in chaos, forcing officials to shut it down. Berlin followed, then Paris, and finally London, the beating heart of world finance, closed its doors. For the first time in modern history, the London Stock Exchange suspended trading. The world's financial arteries had seized up. One newspaper called it the greatest financial crisis the world has ever seen. Governments scrambled. In Berlin, officials ordered banks to close temporarily. In Paris, police were stationed outside the Banque de France to control the crowds. In London, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, convened emergency meetings at the Treasury. Bankers, ministers, and civil servants argued late into the night, searching for a way to prevent total collapse. And in these tense hours, the old rules were broken. By early August, one government after another suspended the gold standard. Paper notes would no longer be redeemable from metal. It was presented as a temporary measure, a necessary step until peace returned. But everyone knew peace was slipping away. In Britain, the government passed the Currency and Banknotes Act of 1914, giving the Treasury the power to issue paper money not backed by gold. In Germany, the Reichsbank declared that banknotes were now legal tender regardless of gold reserves. In France, emergency decrees allowed banks to delay repayments and restrict withdrawals. In less than a week, centuries of financial orthodoxy were swept aside. But governments had not just suspended gold, they had also made a new discovery: the power of paper. With the gold constraint removed, they could print money to finance the war effort. What had once been seen as reckless, even dangerous, was now a weapon of survival. Ordinary citizens, however, were bewildered. To them, the change felt like a betrayal. In Berlin, angry crowds shouted outside banks, demanding their savings back in gold. In Paris, shopkeepers grew suspicious of paper money, some refusing it entirely. In London, rumors spread that the pound was worthless without gold, and panic buying swept through the markets. Governments moved swiftly to control the narrative. Posters appeared, urging citizens to trust the nation's credit. Newspapers ran editorials, reassuring readers that nothing had changed. But something had changed. Everything had changed. Consider one striking example: the bank holiday of August 1914 in Britain. For 3 days, banks remained closed, an unprecedented pause in the financial system. When they reopened, they no longer paid out gold. Instead, the government issued new £1 and 10-shilling notes, the so-called Bradburys, named after the Treasury official whose signature appeared on them. These flimsy pieces of paper quickly became symbols of a new era, money backed not by gold, but by government decree. It was a quiet revolution. Looking back, one economist wrote, "In that week of panic, the financial civilization of the 19th century came to an end." The suspension of gold was only the beginning. With the old order broken, governments would soon discover how far they could push the limits of finance. They would borrow on a scale never seen before, appeal to citizens to invest their savings in war bonds, and unleash propaganda campaigns to stir patriotic duty. But in July and August of 1914, no one could see that far ahead. All they knew was the old world had collapsed overnight. The promises of gold, stability, and certainty had vanished. In their place stood an uncertain experiment, an experiment that would carry Europe into the most destructive conflict in history. And so the war to end all wars would not only be fought with rifles and artillery, it would be fought with promises, with paper, and with the fragile faith of millions who clung to the belief that their money still meant something. The age of financial war had begun. When the guns roared in August 1914, Europe's leaders promised it would be a short war. Home by Christmas, they said. The reality was far different. By autumn, armies were bogged down in trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Supplies were running low. Casualties were mounting. And then came the dreadful realization: this war would not last months, it would last years. That meant money, more money than governments had ever needed before. At first, ministers tried the old methods. They dipped into their gold reserves, but those were already thin. They raised taxes, but tax revenues were sluggish and politically explosive. Imagine telling a factory worker in 1915 that, on top of sending his son to the front, he would also pay higher taxes to fund the shells that might kill him? No, that was a recipe for unrest. The solution was obvious, but unprecedented: borrow. Not just from banks, not just from foreign creditors, but from the people themselves. In Britain, David Lloyd George, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced the first great borrowing scheme. The government would sell bonds to the public. Safe investments, he promised, guaranteed by the nation, paying interest once victory was achieved. It was both a patriotic duty and a financial opportunity. In Germany, the government launched the Kriegleihe, war loans, inviting ordinary Germans to lend their savings to the fatherland. Posters declared, "Subscribe to the war loan, the enemy will pay." Banks, schools, churches, even theaters turned into subscription points where citizens could sign their names and hand over their savings. In France, they did the same, appealing to patriotism and revenge. In Paris, placards read, "Lend your gold to France. She will return it when the enemy has paid." In every major capital, governments turned to the same formula: bonds, loans, patriotic appeals. It was a way to transform personal savings into bullets, uniforms, artillery, and food. But here's the genius and the dark brilliance of these campaigns. They weren't presented as dry financial instruments. They were wrapped in myth, drama, and emotional storytelling. Picture walking down a Berlin street in 1915. Posters scream from every wall. One shows a German soldier, bayonet fixed, charging into battle. The caption, "Subscribe to the war loan, and he will not fight in vain." Another shows a terrified child clutching her mother's dress with the words, "Your savings will protect her future." In London, recruitment-style posters were repurposed for finance. One famous design showed Lord Kitchener, finger outstretched, his stern eyes staring directly at the viewer. "Your country needs money as well as men." In France, posters evoked Joan of Arc, the revolution, and national honor. Investing in bonds was not just financial prudence, it was joining the eternal struggle of France itself. This was more than economics, it was psychological warfare aimed not at the enemy, but at one's own people. Governments had to convince millions to trade personal security for national survival. Let us step inside an ordinary household. In Berlin, a shoemaker sits at the dinner table. His wife worries about the cost of food, which has already risen. His eldest son is in uniform, writing letters from the front. Now the government is asking for their savings. They hesitate, but neighbors are already whispering, "Have you subscribed yet?" Everyone is. Even the priest has urged it from the pulpit. So, they sign the papers, they hand over their small savings account to the Reichsbank, believing they are helping both their son and their country. In London, a clerk at Lloyd's Bank proudly buys £100 in war bonds. His colleagues cheer. The manager pins his name on a board listing subscribers. It feels patriotic, almost heroic. He is now doing his part. In Paris, widows line up with tiny purses, dropping coins into collection boxes labeled "Pour la Patrie." School children are marched to ceremonies where they hand over pocket money in exchange for miniature war bond certificates. The war bond was not just a financial instrument, it was a social contract, a test of loyalty. Those who refused were branded cowards, profiteers, even traitors. And here lies the deeper truth. These campaigns were not only about raising money, they were about controlling morale. Every poster, every slogan, every parade of subscribers was designed to send a message. The nation is united, the war is winnable, the sacrifices are shared. Consider Germany again. Between 1914 and 1918, the Kaiser's government launched 9 war loan drives. Each was treated like a national festival. Newspapers trumpeted subscription totals like battle victories. "Our people have once again shown their loyalty," read one Berlin paper after the 1916 loan drive. But beneath the headlines, cracks appeared. By 1917, subscriptions were falling. The wealthy still bought bonds, but ordinary workers, battered by inflation and shortages, had little left to give. Posters became more desperate, slogans shriller. The loans were still declared a success, but the truth was evident: confidence was waning. Britain faced similar strains, but had 2 advantages: London's financial might and the resources of empire. Unlike Germany, cut off from global markets, Britain could borrow abroad. American banks, especially J.P. Morgan and Company, became lifelines. By 1917, Britain had borrowed billions from the United States, much of it funneled directly to the purchase of munitions, food, and raw materials. But even Britain needed its people. Posters urged, "If you cannot fight, finance." Schools held bond drives, churches preached the gospel of sacrifice, newspapers published honor rolls of subscribers. By 1918, more than 17 million Britons had purchased war bonds, an astonishing number in a population of just 45 million. The message was clear: to win the war, the nation had to mortgage its own future. Here's the paradox. The war bond was both brilliant and dangerous. Brilliant because it mobilized money on a scale no tax system could achieve. It turned ordinary citizens into investors in victory. It gave governments the resources to fight wars of unprecedented length and intensity. But dangerous because it planted the seeds of betrayal. These bonds were promises that would have to be repaid with interest after the war. Citizens believed in those promises because governments swore the enemy would pay. "Germany will pay," said the French. "The enemy will foot the bill," said the British. But as we will see, when the guns finally fell silent, those promises would collide with reality. The enemy could not pay enough. The debt burdens were crushing, and ordinary citizens who had given their savings in faith would be left holding paper that was worth far less than what they had been promised. By 1916 and 1917, governments grew harsher. What had begun as patriotic encouragement turned into social pressure and finally into coercion. Employers were pressured to deduct bond subscriptions from wages. Communities shamed those who did not subscribe. In some places, banks reported reluctant citizens to local officials. The war bond had become more than voluntary patriotism. It was a measure of obedience. The war of numbers. By 1918, the results were staggering. Germany had raised over 100 billion marks through war loans. Britain had sold more than £7 billion in bonds. France, despite devastation, issued loans worth more than 130 billion francs. Never before had governments borrowed so much, so quickly, from so many. It was the financial equivalent of total war. Every household, every family, every savings account was drawn into the conflict. But here's the irony. The same governments that preached sacrifice and unity were also unleashing the dark twin of borrowing: inflation. As paper flooded the system, prices crept upward. By 1917, bread in Berlin cost twice what it had in 1914. Coal in Paris was scarce and expensive. Even in Britain, insulated by empire, the cost of living soared. Citizens had given their savings to the state, only to watch those savings erode in value. A loaf of bread, a sack of coal, a pound of butter, these became the true measures of wealth, not government promises. And so, beneath the patriotic posters and parades of bond subscribers, another story was taking shape, one of hardship, suspicion, and quiet betrayal. That story will unfold in the next chapter as we see how the printing press, unleashed by the suspension of gold, began to change the very meaning of money itself. The battlefield of the First World War was not only mud and trenches, it was also paper and ink. While millions bled in Flanders, governments were waging another war at home, a war with printing presses. The weapons here were not rifles or shells, but banknotes. And the victims were not soldiers, but ordinary citizens whose savings evaporated as governments quietly inflated away the value of money. The first domino fell in 1914. When Britain, France, and Germany all suspended the gold standard, they crossed a line that had anchored civilization's money for centuries. Before the war, every pound, franc, or mark could be exchanged for a fixed weight of gold. That promise kept governments honest. It limited how much they could spend, how much they could borrow, and how much paper they could print. But war burned through gold reserves faster than any treasury could handle. By September 1914, queues formed outside banks as citizens rushed to exchange paper for gold coins, fearing paper would lose its value. Governments panicked. They slammed the doors shut. Gold payments were suspended. From that moment, money was no longer as good as gold. It was as good as politics, as good as the promises of ministers who swore the paper in your hand was still sound. At first, the printing presses whirred cautiously. New notes were issued to cover immediate costs: soldiers' wages, contracts with armament firms, food for cities. But as the war dragged on, governments discovered something intoxicating. Paper solved problems. Paper could pay soldiers when taxes fell short. Paper could buy supplies when loans slowed. Paper could cover deficits without raising unpopular taxes. By 1916, the presses were running day and night. In Berlin, the Reichsbank expanded note circulation from 2.9 billion marks in 1913 to 27 billion by 1918. In Paris, the Banque de France issued notes far beyond its pre-war limits. In London, new treasury notes flooded the market, nicknamed Bradburys after the treasury official whose signature appeared on them. The result was the same everywhere. Prices rose, savings shrank, and money lost its anchor. Inflation was called the silent tax for a reason. Unlike official taxes, it required no laws, no votes, no debates in Parliament. It simply eroded wealth invisibly, day by day. A loaf of bread that cost 20 pfennigs in Berlin in 1914 cost 40 by 1916. A pound of butter in Paris doubled in price between 1914 and 1917. In Britain, coal prices soared so high that working-class families shivered through winters. Imagine being a clerk with a small nest egg in savings. In 1914, it could buy you a modest retirement. By 1918, it might barely cover a few months of rent. The money you had carefully set aside was being stolen, not by thieves in the night, but by your own government's printing press. The statistics are dry, but the reality was raw. In Berlin, women queued for hours outside bakeries, only to find shelves empty or prices raised while they waited. In Paris, housewives learned to stretch flour with potato starch to make bread last longer. In London, meat became scarce. Families substituted with fish or went without. In Petrograd, queues for food stretched for blocks, guarded by police to prevent riots. The war had already taken fathers, brothers, and sons. Now it took the security of savings, the stability of prices, the dignity of daily life. And yet, officials smiled and reassured, the fundamentals are sound. The currency remains strong. Governments knew inflation was dangerous. If people lost faith in money, the home front could collapse. So they fought a propaganda war. Posters urged citizens to trust the state. Newspapers printed glowing articles about the stability of the franc, the pound, the mark. In Germany, officials insisted that any hardships were temporary. The enemy will pay. In Britain, ministers declared that sacrifices now meant prosperity later. But workers were not fooled. Strikes began to spread in munitions factories, dockyards, and mines. In 1917 alone, Britain saw over 200 strikes. In France, railway workers walked off the job. In Germany, 300,000 Berlin workers went on strike in January 1918, demanding peace and bread. Inflation was not just an economic issue. It was a political bomb ticking beneath the war effort. Nowhere was the bomb more explosive than in Russia. The Tsarist regime had entered the war with vast gold reserves, over 1.2 billion rubles worth. But by 1915, it was printing far more rubles than it could cover. Prices doubled, then tripled. By 1917, inflation was running above 200%. For a peasant in Tambov, the ruble became meaningless. They refused to sell grain for paper money. Food shipments to cities collapsed. Petrograd starved. Workers rioted. Soldiers mutinied. When the February Revolution erupted in 1917, it was fueled not only by anger at the war, but by the collapse of the ruble in every market stall and every breadline. The Tsar's throne was toppled not just by politics, but by a printing press. Britain's story was less dramatic, but no less revealing. The government was terrified of inflation undermining faith in sterling, so it borrowed heavily abroad, especially from the United States, to avoid printing too much. Still, by 1918, the pound's purchasing power had fallen by nearly 1/3. The working class bore the brunt. Wages lagged behind prices. By 1917, the average London worker could afford less food than in 1914, despite working longer hours in munitions plants. Strikes rippled through the Clyde shipyards, the Welsh coal mines, and London's transport system. But Britain's genius was in presentation. Chancellor Reginald McKenna and his successor Bonar Law framed inflation as controlled and temporary. The public grumbled, but compared to the chaos on the continent, sterling still looked strong. The illusion held, barely. France's war was fought on its own soil. Whole regions were devastated, farms were burned, factories destroyed. The Banque de France printed massive amounts of paper to keep the economy afloat. By 1918, circulation had quadrupled. The franc lost nearly 70% of its pre-war value. But the French people endured. Why? Partly patriotism, partly hope for reparations from Germany. Every pamphlet, every speech assured them, Germany will pay, you will be repaid. The tragedy, of course, was that Germany could not pay enough to cover the mountains of debt. But that betrayal would only become clear in the 1920s. Germany's inflation was the most severe of the major powers during the war, and it only worsened afterward. By the end of 1918, the mark had lost over half its pre-war value. Workers demanded daily wage adjustments. Shopkeepers repriced goods hourly. Housewives became experts at bartering, trading clothing, jewelry, or furniture for food. The government issued ever larger notes, 20 marks, 50 marks, 1,000 marks. Each new denomination felt like an admission of failure. And yet, ministers reassured, these sacrifices are temporary. Victory will repay all. But Germany did not win. And when defeat came, the fragile financial house of cards collapsed into the infamous hyperinflation of the early 1920s. The lesson of wartime inflation was clear. Once governments learned they could print to cover expenses, they never fully stopped. The gold standard, broken in 1914, would never return in the same form. Inflation had become a permanent feature of modern life, and ordinary people had learned, bitterly, that money was not solid. It could melt away like snow in spring. Imagine the Müller family in Berlin, 1918. The father, a tailor, subscribed to war bonds in 1915, proudly giving 500 marks, his life savings. The mother stretched food with turnips and potatoes as prices soared. Their son returned from the front, wounded. By war's end, their bonds were nearly worthless. Their savings gone, their rent doubled, their food scarce. They had given everything: their money, their son's health, their daily comfort. And what they received was paper, promises, broken faith. This was the human face of inflation. And here lies the tragic paradox. The same printing presses that saved governments from collapse in 1916 and 1917 destroyed the stability of nations in the 1920s. Germany would descend into hyperinflation so extreme that money lost all meaning. France would stagger under debts it could not repay. Britain would try to restore the gold standard and failed disastrously. And the United States, untouched by inflation at home, would inherit the financial crown. The war of printing presses was over, but the war of debt was only beginning. By 1917, Europe was exhausted. The fronts had barely shifted since 1914, yet the cost, in blood and in treasure, was staggering. France was drowning in debt, Britain was pawning its overseas assets, Germany was bleeding under blockade, and across the Atlantic, the United States stood apart. Its fields were green with harvest, its factories hummed with industry, its banks overflowed with capital. While Europe bled, America prospered. Even before declaring war, America was already the arsenal of the Allies. Ships loaded with wheat, steel, coal, and munitions steamed from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. British and French officials crossed the ocean to beg American bankers for loans. The most powerful of them all was J.P. Morgan & Co. In 1915, Morgan became the official purchasing agent for Britain and France. The scale was staggering. By war's end, Morgan's firm had handled more than $3 billion in contracts, weapons, uniforms, food. In effect, one private American bank was financing much of the Allied war machine. But loans from private bankers could only go so far. By 1916, Britain had already sold off billions in U.S. securities, railroads, utilities, mines, to raise cash. Even so, it was running out of gold. The once proud pound sterling, symbol of world finance, was now dependent on American credit. This was the great irony of the war's middle years. While soldiers clung to muddy trenches in Europe, in New York skyscrapers, men in suits wielded pens that mattered just as much as rifles. Then came April 1917. German submarines sinking American ships, the infamous Zimmermann telegram urging Mexico to attack the U.S. With public anger mounting, President Woodrow Wilson stood before Congress on April 2nd and declared, "The world must be made safe for democracy." The United States was in the war. But war required more than speeches. It required money, vast sums of it. The U.S. federal budget in 1916 had been under $1 billion. By 1918, war spending would exceed $12 billion a year. It was an astronomical leap, one that transformed the role of government in American life. How could America raise such sums? The answer was bonds. The Treasury launched a series of Liberty loan campaigns, asking citizens to lend their savings to the government. Posters plastered every wall: "Buy Liberty bonds, defend your country." Banks, schools, churches, even Boy Scout troops were mobilized to sell them. The campaigns became mass spectacles. Famous actors like Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford toured cities urging crowds to invest. Parades wound through streets with floats shaped like battleships and tanks. In some towns, enormous thermometers were erected, the rising red bar showing the progress of bond sales. And the public responded. Millions of Americans, farmers, workers, shopkeepers became bondholders. For many, it was their first direct experience with the machinery of government finance. By war's end, the Liberty loans had raised more than $20 billion. It was an astonishing success, turning the American people themselves into financiers of victory. But bonds alone were not enough. Taxes soared. New levies on income, excess profits, and inheritance were imposed, reshaping the tax system permanently. The war, in short, nationalized finance in a way never seen before in the U.S. There was another player in this financial drama, the Federal Reserve. Created only in 1913, the Fed had been an infant institution, little more than an experiment. But the war thrust it into maturity overnight. It became the manager of Liberty loan sales, the channel for moving credit, the stabilizer of banks under wartime pressure. One historian later wrote, "The war made the Federal Reserve." Without it, the torrent of wartime finance might have overwhelmed the system. With it, the U.S. had the machinery to mobilize capital on a scale equal to any battlefield army. While America financed itself with Liberty loans, the Allies turned increasingly to Washington. Between 1917 and 1919, the U.S. government lent over $10 billion to Britain, France, Italy, and others. It was not a gift. These were loans, meant to be repaid with interest. And yet, repayment was always doubtful. By 1918, France's tax base had collapsed. Britain's debts already dwarfed its peacetime revenues. In truth, the loans were less about repayment and more about survival. Still, the symbolism was clear. The financial axis of the world had shifted. London, once the unquestioned center of global finance, was now overshadowed by New York and Washington. The financial mobilization of the U.S. was wrapped in the language of patriotism. Liberty Bond posters depicted German soldiers as monsters, urging citizens to fight with your dollars. Songs were written. One popular tune declared, "We're all giving for the red, white, and blue." But beneath the patriotic surface was a deeper truth. This was the moment when ordinary Americans became directly bound to the fate of the state through finance. Their savings, their paychecks, their very consumption became part of the war machine. By the time the guns fell silent in November 1918, the transformation was complete. The United States had gone from debtor to creditor, from peripheral player to central power. It had lent billions abroad, absorbed foreign assets, and established the dollar as a rising rival to the pound. In New York, the stock exchange reopened after the war with a confidence that astonished visitors. British financiers, once the masters of global capital, now traveled to Wall Street to raise money. The war had done what decades of commerce alone could not. It had made America the banker of the world. Yet behind the statistics and financial charts, there were personal stories. A Kansas farmer who invested $50 in Liberty bonds wrote in his diary, "It is a little enough sacrifice if it helps bring John home safe from France." An immigrant factory worker in Chicago proudly bought a bond saying, "I came here with nothing, and now I am part of America's fight." And for millions, the experience left a permanent mark. They had learned that money could be a weapon as potent as any rifle. The war was not yet over, but the financial order of the future was already taking shape. No longer would Europe dominate global credit. The United States, with its vast resources and its newfound central bank, had stepped into the role of creditor-in-chief. It was a transformation that would shape not only the peace negotiations at Versailles, but the entire 20th century. Because once a nation becomes the world's banker, it rarely lets go of the power that comes with it. November 11th, 1918. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. Across Europe, bells rang. Crowds flooded the streets. Soldiers embraced each other with tears in their eyes. After more than 4 years of slaughter, the Great War was over. But while the front lines went quiet, another kind of war, quieter, invisible, fought in ledgers and offices, was only just beginning. Because victory had been bought on credit, and when the soldiers laid down their rifles, the financiers opened their books. By the armistice, the numbers were staggering. Allied war debt exceeded $140 billion. The Central Powers had spent another $60 billion. Britain owed more than $35 billion, of which $4 billion was to the United States. France owed around $30 billion, heavily to Britain and America. Even tiny nations like Belgium had borrowed sums equal to many times their annual budgets. In other words, the world had mortgaged its future. The gold standard, once the bedrock of financial trust, was shattered. Entire currencies had been debased. Inflation, debt, and scarcity haunted every capital city. The soldiers returned home to broken economies. Factories stood idle. Farms lay in ruin. Millions of widows and orphans looked to governments for pensions and support, but governments themselves were gasping under the weight of debt. The war was over. The financial struggle was not. When the victors gathered in Paris in 1919, it was not just to redraw borders, it was also to settle accounts. In the grand halls of Versailles and the smaller rooms of secret committees, politicians haggled not only over territory, but also over money. Britain demanded reparations. France, devastated by German invasion, demanded them even more fiercely. Italy demanded its share of spoils, and the United States, though preaching lofty principles of Wilson's 14 points, quietly expected repayment of every dollar it had lent to its allies. This was not just peace, this was accounting. At the heart of the financial battle was Germany. Blamed as the aggressor, stripped of colonies and military power, Germany was also saddled with reparations. In 1921, the Allies fixed the sum, 132 billion gold marks. To grasp the scale, that was roughly 3 times Germany's entire pre-war GDP. It was, quite simply, impossible. But impossible or not, the Allies insisted. For France especially, reparations were not just about money, they were about justice. Whole regions of northern France had been reduced to rubble, factories destroyed, farmland poisoned with trenches and shell holes. How could France rebuild without German payment? And for Britain, already indebted to America, reparations were a way to shift the burden. If Germany paid France and Britain, then France and Britain could repay the U.S. Thus began a vicious circle. How did Germany pay? At first, it tried to deliver in kind, coal, timber, industrial equipment. But each delivery weakened its own economy. Then it tried printing money. The result was catastrophic. By 1923, the German mark had collapsed into one of the most infamous hyperinflations in history. Prices doubled every few days. Families carried wages home in wheelbarrows. Children built kites from banknotes because they were cheaper than paper. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Middle-class families saw their savings evaporate overnight. Pensioners starved. The bitterness was immense. And all of it was tied to the impossible reparations imposed at Versailles. In truth, much of the money was never really paid. Instead, America began lending to Germany so that Germany could pay reparations to France and Britain, who in turn paid their debts to America. It was a financial merry-go-round, dizzying but unsustainable. Britain, once the world's financial master, emerged humbled. The war had left it with colossal debts, a weakened industrial base, and a financial system now dependent on America. London was still a great financial center, but it had been eclipsed by New York. The British government faced a dilemma. Should it inflate its way out of debt or return to the gold standard at the old pre-war rate? It chose the latter in 1925 under Churchill's chancellorship, a decision hailed as a return to greatness, but in fact a crushing mistake. The pound was pegged far too high, making British exports uncompetitive, deepening unemployment, and sowing misery among workers. It was financial pride at the expense of reality. France, though a victor, bore scars deeper than most. Entire provinces were devastated. Millions of men were dead or crippled. Its deaths were astronomical. The French government relied heavily on reparations for recovery, but when German payments faltered, France responded with force. In 1923, French troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to seize coal and steel directly. The move caused chaos, worsening German hyperinflation, but also revealed the desperation of a country that had won, yet was still bankrupt. Meanwhile, Russia, once one of the great powers, had collapsed entirely. The Bolsheviks, having seized power in 1917, repudiated all imperial debts. Foreign investors who had once poured money into Russian bonds saw their fortunes vanish overnight. For the first time, global finance faced a new kind of risk: ideological revolution. A government that simply said, "We do not pay." The shockwaves rattled markets for years. And then there was the United States. Flush with gold and credit, the U.S. was the new financial titan, but it was also reluctant. Many Americans wanted to retreat into isolationism, to pull back from Europe's endless quarrels. Yet the debts tied America in whether it liked it or not. Wall Street bankers and Washington politicians alike knew if Britain and France collapsed financially, so too would America's loans. Thus, the 1920s became a decade of fragile financial diplomacy, rescheduling debts, arranging new loans, trying to hold together a system that was already fraying. Through all this high finance, ordinary people struggled. In Britain, veterans marched in protest, demanding jobs and pensions. In France, widows waited for promised compensation that never came. In Germany, middle-class families saw their life savings destroyed, their sense of dignity shattered. The war was over, but the suffering did not. It had only changed shape. From trenches and shells to debts and inflation, the weapon was now money. By the mid-1920s, one thing was clear. The old world order had been shattered. The gold standard was no longer the unshakable foundation it once was. Europe was drowning in debt. America had become the new financial master, and the bitterness of financial ruin was fueling political extremism, especially in Germany. The war had not ended. It had brought a fragile, unstable truce, one that would collapse within 2 decades. The great illusion of 1919 was that peace could be signed on paper while debts remained unpaid in reality. Politicians pretended the numbers added up. Citizens were told the sacrifices were worth it, but the truth was harsher. The financial scars of World War I were deeper than the military ones, and they would not heal. As one French economist said at the time, "The war is not over until the last bond is paid." And by that measure, the First World War lingered long into the 1920s and 1930s, haunting economies, poisoning politics, and paving the road towards an even greater catastrophe. The 1920s are often remembered as the Roaring Twenties. Jazz, skyscrapers, automobiles, flappers, and modern life bursting into color after the gray years of war. But beneath the glitter was a brittle financial system, stitched together with IOUs and wishful thinking. The war had not really ended. Its debts and financial distortions lived on, hidden inside the prosperity. The 1920s were not the roaring triumph of peace. They were the quiet ticking of a financial time bomb. At the center of the illusion was a circular flow of money that looked stable but was built on sand. Here's how it worked. Germany owed reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain owed debts to the United States. But Germany couldn't pay reparations. Its economy was in ruins. So what happened? America stepped in. Wall Street banks, flush with capital, lent money to Germany. Germany then used those loans to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain, in turn, used the reparations to repay their debts to America. It was a closed loop, a financial merry-go-round. Money circled from New York to Berlin, to Paris, to London, then back to New York. The system kept everyone afloat, for a while, but it was not sustainable. It was credit built on credit, promises resting on promises. In 1924, the Allies formalized this arrangement with the Dawes Plan. Under the plan, German reparations were restructured. Payments were scaled down, spread out, made to look more manageable. To help Germany, American banks poured in fresh loans, billions of dollars. For a moment, it worked. The German economy stabilized, inflation slowed, cities rebuilt. Berlin in the mid-1920s even became a cultural capital again. Cabarets, theaters, new art movements. On the surface, life glittered. But it was a glitter financed by debt. Germany's economy now floated on borrowed American money. And when loans dry up, glitter turns to dust. Meanwhile, Britain tried to restore its pre-war prestige by returning to the gold standard in 1925, pegging the pound to its old value. It was a decision steeped in pride. The pound, after all, had once been the currency of empire. To let it fall was unthinkable. But the reality was brutal. Britain's war debt, weakened industry, and high unemployment made the old parity unsustainable. Returning to gold at the pre-war rate overvalued the pound, strangling exports and worsening the slump. Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, later admitted it was one of the gravest mistakes of his career. It was a financial illusion, the belief that by pretending nothing had changed, Britain could somehow turn back time. But France, on the other hand, played a different game. Haunted by the destruction of 1914-18, it prioritized security above all else. When German reparations faltered, France occupied the Ruhr in 1923, seizing coal and steel directly. It worked in the short term, but deepened German resentment. Economically, France struggled with debt and reconstruction. Its government, like Britain's, relied on reparations and loans. French citizens were urged to buy bonds, to save, to sacrifice. And they did, but the underlying financial cracks remained. All the while, America played the role of banker to the world, reluctantly. On the one hand, U.S. banks were eager to lend. Wall Street in the 1920s was booming, and foreign loans were lucrative. From Latin America to Eastern Europe, dollars flowed outward. On the other hand, Washington demanded repayment of war debts. Politicians insisted the Allies pay every cent. This created resentment abroad and locked the system into its fragile merry-go-round. America had become the creditor of last resort, but it lacked the will to lead responsibly. It wanted to profit without managing the risks. By 1929, the illusion required another patch. The Young Plan further restructured reparations, reducing the totals but stretching them out over decades. Once again, Germany breathed a little easier. Once again, American banks kept lending. And once again, the illusion deepened. It was as if the world believed financial engineering could erase the scars of the war, that by pushing debts into the future, the past would stop haunting the present. But history cannot be postponed forever. Beneath the surface of prosperity, cracks were spreading. In Germany, reliance on American loans created a fragile bubble. Any disruption in U.S. credit would topple the system. In Britain, unemployment never truly recovered. Strikes spread. The general strike of 1926 paralyzed the nation, a symptom of an economy out of balance. In France, political instability grew. Governments rose and fell in rapid succession, unable to solve the debt trap. And in America, speculation on Wall Street reached fever pitch. Brokers lent to investors, who borrowed more, who speculated further. It was debt upon debt, leverage upon leverage, the same pattern that had built the interwar system globally. The illusion of prosperity was about to crack wide open. Amid these fragile structures, ordinary people lived lives of hope and anxiety. A German shopkeeper who had seen his savings destroyed in 1923 now cautiously rebuilt his business, but always feared the next collapse. A British miner, unemployed after the return to gold, marched in hunger demonstrations. An American farmer, encouraged to buy Liberty bonds and take loans during the war, now faced falling crop prices and mounting debt. For them, the financial illusions of governments and bankers were not abstract. They were rent unpaid, meals skipped, futures postponed. The system might have staggered forward longer, But history had other plans. In October 1929, the Wall Street stock market collapsed. The flow of American credit to Europe dried up overnight. The merry-go-round stopped spinning. Germany could no longer borrow to pay reparations. France and Britain could no longer pay their debts to America. The whole fragile pyramid of credit came crashing down. The interwar financial illusions were shattered. Looking back, the 1920s stand not as a decade of triumph, but as a warning. Governments and bankers tried to paper over the financial scars of World War I with loans, bonds, and propaganda. They created the illusion of prosperity, but not the substance. And when the illusion collapsed, the consequences were catastrophic. Depression, extremism, another war. The lesson is harsh. Debts do not vanish because politicians rearrange them. They linger, poisoning the future until reality forces a reckoning. As the 1930s began, the world faced a new nightmare, the Great Depression. The illusions of the 1920s had bought a decade of fragile peace, but they had also sown the seeds of collapse. The debts of the Great War were not gone. They had only changed shape. And just as in 1914, ordinary people would pay the price first. It began with whispers. In the autumn of 1929, stock prices in New York started to wobble. For years, they had only gone one way, up. Investors borrowed money to buy shares. Shares rose, confidence grew, and the cycle repeated. But no bubble floats forever. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, panic hit the trading floor. Crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange as prices tumbled. Banks and big firms tried to stabilize the market, but by October 29th, Black Tuesday, it was chaos. Billions of dollars in paper wealth evaporated in days. For America, the crash was shocking. For the world, it was catastrophic. The crash cut off the flow of American loans abroad. That was the oxygen of the interwar system. When it stopped, the whole financial architecture suffocated. Germany. Without U.S. credit, reparations collapsed. Banks failed, businesses shuttered. Unemployment soared past 6 million. Britain. Exports plunged. The country abandoned the gold standard in 1931, a humiliating retreat from financial pride. France. At first more insulated, but as partners fell, trade collapsed, and the franc soon came under pressure. The United States itself. Farms failed, factories closed, breadlines grew. The Versailles system, propped up by illusions and loans, crumbled into dust. By 1932, at the Lausanne Conference, the reparations issue was effectively dead. Germany had no money. Britain and France, facing depression themselves, had no leverage. America, too deep in crisis, had no will to enforce payment. The entire premise of Versailles, that Germany could pay for the war, was revealed as an impossible dream. Reparations were written off, debts suspended, obligations ignored. The financial backbone of the post-war world was gone. Numbers tell only part of the story. The human toll was immense. In Berlin, families scavenged scraps, their savings wiped out once more. In London, queues at unemployment exchanges stretched for blocks. In Chicago, men sold apples on street corners for pennies. The same miners, shopkeepers, farmers, and veterans who had already sacrificed in the war now faced despair in peace. One German observer captured the bitterness. First, the war robbed us of our youth, then Versailles robbed us of our dignity, and now the crash robs us of our future. Economic collapse is not just about hunger and poverty. It is about desperation, and desperation breeds extremism. In Germany, the Nazis exploited the anger, promising to smash Versailles, to restore jobs, to resurrect pride. They surged in popularity. In Italy, Mussolini pointed to the failures of democracy and claimed only strong men could deliver stability. In Japan, militarists argued that expansion abroad was the only way to escape depression at home. The failure of Versailles was not just financial, it was political. By building a peace on impossible debts and illusions, the victors had planted the seeds of dictatorship and war. One of the clearest symbols of collapse came in 1931, when Britain abandoned the gold standard. For over a century, gold had been the anchor of global finance, with London its capital. The war shook it, the 1920s strained it, and the Depression broke it. When Britain left gold, dozens of other nations followed. The international financial system of the 19th century, stable, predictable, universal, was gone forever. Meanwhile, the United States retreated into itself. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 strangled trade further. Banks failed by the thousands. By 1933, unemployment reached 25%. Franklin Roosevelt, elected in 1932, declared a bank holiday, shut down the system, and rebuilt it under the New Deal. But America's inward turn left Europe without leadership, at the worst possible moment. By the early 1930s, Versailles was a ghost. The reparations clauses were abandoned. The debt chains dissolved. The gold standard shattered. The idea of making Germany pay collapsed under its own weight. What remained was resentment, humiliation, and hunger. The financial illusions of the 1920s bought a decade, but not a future. And in that vacuum of despair, war was waiting. The collapse of the interwar financial system shows a brutal truth. Peace cannot be built on debt and illusion. If debts are impossible, they will not be paid. If prosperity is fake, it will not last. The world learned this lesson in the hardest possible way. And as the 1930s unfolded, the failure of Versailles and the Great Depression together set the stage for an even greater catastrophe. When people think of World War I, they picture trenches, barbed wire, and mud. But there was another battlefield, one without bullets, where the casualties were invisible. This was the war of money. Governments mortgaged their futures to pay for shells. Bankers rewrote the rules of finance. Citizens handed over savings, only to watch them vanish in inflation or default. And when the guns fell silent, the war of money did not end. It simply changed shape. Reparations, debts, defaults, these were the artillery of the peace. The world had fought one war on the battlefield and then another in the banks. The greatest illusion of all was the idea that Germany could pay for the entire war. It was a fantasy born of vengeance. Politicians in Paris and London promised their voters that the Hun will pay. They spoke of reparations not just as justice, but as a solution, a way to rebuild without taxing their own people. But Germany had been bled white. Its industries wrecked, its workers exhausted, its savings destroyed. Demanding billions in reparations was like demanding water from a stone. And yet the illusion persisted. Every time Germany faltered, committees met, plans were drawn, numbers shuffled. The Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, endless conferences, all to disguise a truth no one wanted to admit. The money was never there. While statesmen argued, ordinary people paid the price. A British veteran, promised a land fit for heroes, returned to unemployment and rationing. A French widow who had invested her savings in war bonds discovered they were worth only a fraction of their promise. A German worker, already stripped by inflation, watched politicians sign away his wages to reparations he never agreed to. For them, Versailles was not a treaty. It was a chain of debt pulling tighter every year. Debt is not just numbers on paper. It is emotional. In Germany, reparations became a national humiliation. Propaganda posters depicted the nation as a man in chains, crushed by the weight of gold. Extremists seized on the anger, promising to smash the system. In France and Britain, resentment flowed the other way. Citizens had sacrificed, bought war bonds, believed in promises. When repayments failed, they felt cheated, betrayed by Germany, betrayed by their own leaders. Resentment on both sides festered. It was not just political, it was personal. The interwar years show how illusions can be more dangerous than defeats. Britain clung to gold, pretending the empire was still strong. France clung to reparations, pretending its sacrifices would be repaid. America clung to isolation, pretending it could be bankered to the world without leading it. Each illusion bought time. But illusions always collapse, and when they did, the cost was greater than facing the truth early. The lesson of Versailles is not just about the past. It is about how wars of money echo long after peace treaties are signed. Every war leaves debts. Every debt creates winners and losers. And if those debts are impossible, they do not vanish, they fester. The First World War was followed by the Great Depression, and then the Second World War, all linked by the financial scars of 1914-18. The true cost of the war was not just millions of lives lost. It was the chain of debt and resentment that dragged the world into another catastrophe. Today, when we look back at Versailles, it's tempting to say they should have known better. But illusions are seductive. They promise easy answers, painless solutions. They tell nations they can spend without sacrifice, punish enemies without cost, win wars without consequences. Versailles teaches us that illusions in finance can be as deadly as illusions in strategy. The battlefield and the bank ledger are linked, and the price of ignoring that link is catastrophe. The war of money is a quieter war, but no less deadly. It is fought in banks and treaties, in ledgers and bonds. It decides who eats, who starves, who rises, who falls. And in the case of World War I, the war of money did not just shape the peace, it destroyed it. When the cannons stopped in 1918, people thought the nightmare was over. The war was won. The peace was signed. The future could begin again. But wars never truly end when the ink dries. Their debts outlive their battles. The First World War was not just a conflict of trenches and empires. It was a financial earthquake that sent aftershocks for a century. The gold standard never truly recovered. Britain limped back to it in the 1920s, only to collapse again in the Great Depression. Germany never escaped the shadow of reparations, the scars of inflation, the bitterness of humiliation. And France carried its debts into political crises that fractured its Third Republic. And America? America stepped forward as the new banker of the world, but with that power came responsibility it was not ready to bear. The war of money had redrawn the map of global finance. Here is a staggering fact. Germany made its final reparations payment for World War I in 2010, 92 years after the armistice. A century of debt, interest, restructuring, and renegotiation. Think about that. Entire generations lived, fought, and died while the ledger of 1914-18 remained open. Soldiers who bled in the trenches had grandchildren who were still paying for it. This was not just history, it was a chain across time. Debt is not just numbers in a bank ledger. It is a story we pass down. In Weimar Germany, it took the form of wheelbarrows of worthless banknotes. In Britain, it took the form of austerity, unemployment, and the desperate attempt to restore lost glory. And in America,
It took the form of Wall Street's new dominance and the responsibility of rescuing Europe when it collapsed again. And for the ordinary saver, the small investor, the shopkeeper, the farmer, the story was always the same. Sacrifice today, promises tomorrow. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The playbook written in 1914 was used again in 1929, in 1945, in 1971, in 2008. Governments learned they could abandon reality, inflate currencies, borrow endlessly, and sell it all with propaganda. The battlefield changes, the weapons change, but the war of money never ends, because money itself is the battlefield. So here is the lesson. The one history does not whisper, but shouts. Wars are not just fought with soldiers, they are fought with savers. The casualties are not only those who fall on battlefields, but those who see their wages eroded, their savings vanish, their futures mortgaged. And the winners are often those who sat far from the front, in boardrooms, in banks, in offices, with clean hands and full ledgers. The war of money is silent, but it is relentless. World War I ended more than a century ago. The trenches are quiet, the cannons rust, the soldiers long buried. But the debts echo still. They remind us that money is not neutral. It is power, it is weaponry, it is control. And unless we learn to see through the illusions, unless we remember that even the strongest financial order can collapse in a matter of days, we will keep fighting the same war over and over. Because history does not lie, and the balance sheet always tells the truth.